Well, we want to thank all of you for being here. Our event is about to start. We also want to thank Champion X, which is our sponsor in this Woodland series, and just some highlights for these upcoming months. On July 12th, we will have another event here at this Blade Gallery, the Iranian Puzzle, Nuclear, Foreign, and Domestic Politics. Our speaker will be an Iran native and expert, Dr. Mohammed Tabar. Back in Houston, we will have Dr. Paris Hotez on COVID's origins, outlook, and lessons for the next pandemic. This will be July 7th. On August 8th, we will have the former Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper. On August 16th, we will have Elliot Ackerman, CIA and Marine officer. He will be talking about America's end in Afghanistan. To also mention, our Global Scholars Academy will be starting July 11th here at the Woodlands. It will go for a week, and this is for high school students. It's like a summer camp for high school students. So if you know anyone who'd be interested, we will be starting in July. And now, to get our program started, I will just talk a little bit about our speaker today. His name is Julian Cardenas. He's a research professor at the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Center of the University of Houston Law Center, where he teaches transnational investment law and arbitration, transnational petroleum law and diplomacy, and geopolitics of oil and gas. He is also visiting professor in arbitration and energy law at the Universidad Externado in Colombia and the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León in Monterrey, Mexico, and the University of the State of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. His current consulting practice focuses on investment regulation for projects in the oil and gas sector and promoting industry best practices for onshore and offshore upstream projects. He frequently works with companies, public authorities, and governments in various areas of oil and gas law and policy. Since June 2019, he sits on the ad hoc Administrative Board of Directors of Petróleos de Venezuela, the Venezuelan national oil company. Cardenas served as career diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela, working on multilateral issues dealing with the United Nations and the Organization of American States, and sovereign border issues with Trinidad, Guyana, Colombia, and Brazil. So, without further ado, I will give the microphone to Ronan.
Thank you, Itziar. Honestly, I think a lot of times I have the easy job. The hardest thing is doing the introduction and reading people's bios. That's a great job, Itziar. That's way harder a lot of times I won't have to do because I get to kind of have a bit of fun. You have to actually read exact text, so thank you. I just want to thank again Champion X for being our wonderful sponsor of our Woodland series this year. John Breed, who's normally here, it is his birthday. So John, maybe if you're watching this later at home, happy birthday. He would be here normally, but thank you to everyone at Champion X and Soma, our past president of the board, for all of your incredible support of the council. And I wanted to say thank you again to Julian. For some of you have seen him before. Julian spoke in the Woodlands maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, I think, at the Cooper School. You've spoken in Houston before. He's a longtime incredible supporter of the council. Some of these interesting people I brought in from Venezuela over the years, and in these opposition figures that you may wonder, how did Ronan connect with them or connect with that? Julian is part of the reason why I was able to make some of those connections. So you've been a great friend and resource to the council. And we're going to get into an interesting discussion about Venezuela, where it is today. But I just thought you yourself have a very interesting story. And more than 20 years ago, Venezuela was kind of dealing with this emerging idea of a populist leader. What does it mean? What do we have to deal with? Long before we saw it happening with Erdogan in Turkey, before it was happening with Bolsonaro in Brazil, or even Putin in Russia, you dealt with it and dealt with it firsthand. You're a career diplomat. You were not appointed by the Chavez regime. Like most people in foreign service, you serve in the foreign service no matter who's in power. Could you maybe just talk about your first, I think you served about 5 years under Chavez, the early years of Chavez, what that was like? I think you told me before that you had met him. what that was like, and ultimately, what was it that kind of just started you to realize not just are things not going well, but they're going very poorly, and sadly, why it was you had to leave?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Rona, and thank you to the Council for the invitation. Thank you to everyone for being here to talk about issues related to Venezuela. What happened in my career, it turns out that my family, an uncle and my father, served at the Venezuelan diplomatic service. And I grew up in that environment, in the sense that I saw them work in international affairs. I saw them working with United Nations and embassies in Europe. And I thought when I was a teenager that was the coolest thing to do, travel the world and being involved in issues with the Security Council. And also what happened is that in the way I deal with my relation with my dad, I was a kid, and I remember I was 10 years old and the war started in Iraq. And then my dad one day explained to me, the 1973 Arab embargo against the United States, and then we got into those topics, and then he started writing articles in a local newspaper. And he did the handwriting of the article, and I had to type those articles to send it to the journal, because I knew how to type in the computer. And then suddenly that became kind of, I started studying diplomacy as a kid. Probably my conversations with my dad deal more with international affairs than talking about football or baseball or kids stuff, right? It was kind of weird, but that was definitely a thing that very early age was for me intellectually fascinating. And then when I finished high school and then entered had the choices to go to school, I got admitted to study international relations in the Universidad Central de Venezuela, which at the time was the only school that could do the public examination to enter the diplomatic career. It was type of the only school in the country that by law, the graduates of that school could make the public examination. So I did that. When I graduated, I had other interests. I wanted to become a musician. I was a violinist at the time.
He's a classically trained violinist. If you want to see him in concert in August, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, but actually I started working as a violinist in a symphony orchestra in Venezuela. And I did a public exam, and I thought they won't call me. I have other interests. I was studying law at the same time. I was doing law school in the evening. And then I got the call. I was admitted by public examination. I was invited to join the Foreign Service as an attaché in international affairs, and then as third secretary, which in the rankings of diplomats is the first rank of the diplomatic career. And I served. And I started working with people who worked with my dad or my uncle for decades. And it was kind of, I was very familiar with the environment. I started working with multilateral affairs in the very early stage. And as you said, I did, and I went through all the preparation of what ended happening in Venezuela. I remember one of the first things I worked was the negotiation of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. How important is that document, and probably is one of the international agreements that are overlooked, or people just call to that agreement every few years. And it was an international agreement agreed through the Organization of American States that defines democracy not by just going to polls and elections, but democracy is more than that. Democracy is a respect of separation of powers, is check and balance system, is respect of human rights, is freedom of speech, is constitutional systems and democracy. And we have seen how some regimes in the region, they know how to bifurcate democracy, they know how to manipulate this system of check and balance and remain in power. We have seen that new fashion. We're not seeing the same type of strong dictatorship regime that existed in the 20th century. We are seeing more authoritarian regime in a more sophisticated way, and I think that was part of the advice that the Chavez regime had at the very early stage. I can say, the members of my main generation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela, we at some point we were trained by diplomatic members of the diplomatic career, and we entered the Foreign Affairs Academy in Venezuela. But then after 2002, after Chavez faced one of the biggest demonstrations that had seen the country in the last 20 years, that ended with Chavez out of power for 3 days, then we started being trained by members of the Cuban Foreign Service. We started being more indoctrinated than educated inside of the diplomatic career. And that thing that started in 2002, 2003, then it was for me clear that that agreement contract that I signed when you enter the diplomatic career in Venezuela, you sign a contract for 25 years. The career is 25 years to become an ambassador, which is the end goal of people entering into this career. But at the time, I saw that there was no chances. Already, the strike at Petróleos of Venezuela had already happened. The fire of more than 20,000 workers of the oil industry that was drained. I mean, from all that talent, changed completely the shape of that company. And it was clear to me that the next goal, the next institution that they will tackle will be the Foreign Service. One of the reasons, they have political positions abroad. They had salaries in US dollars, which was attractive in a country where inflation was 30 or more % annually, and devaluation was a nightmare at the early years of Chavez, and then they started in 2003 and foreign exchange control. So you could not change bolivars, the national currency, into US dollars. So I worked almost 6 years at the Foreign Service. At the beginning, it was a career as any other. It took time to the Chavismo to take control. There was still an institution there that lasts for a few years. But then you started seeing how for them was very important to take control of key embassies, to key negotiation. That international agreement, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, I participated in the negotiation of that agreement, and at some point we got the order not to participate or to continue participating in that agreement. That they knew that agreement at some point will be used against Chavez regime. They knew because they have a totalitarian goals from the beginning, from the early stages. So each of the articles included in that agreement, it was at some point, they had clear idea that would be applied against them. And I mean, they were pretty sure, and part of the strategy that they did was to approve an international agreement in the oil sector called Petrocaribe. Petrocaribe was an international agreement that joined 14 nations in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean islands that have one member, one vote at the Organization of American States. So having the control selling oil at discount through this international agreement, they control the OAS for more than a decade. And that Inter-American Democratic Charter was blocked because it needs 2/3 of the members, of the 34 members of the OAS to be applicable. And through that strategy of petrodiplomacy, they were very successful. That was an era where the United States and Canada probably, they never got one resolution passed in their favor. Because Chavismo, and then they had Correa in Ecuador, they had Evo in Bolivia, they had Lula in Brazil, they had the Kirchners in Argentina. they reach to control the institution. And when you check the voting, probably you're not checking votings of international organization, but that is something that I follow because you can see balance of power through the voting in these organizations. You can see how Venezuela was winning and blocking the works of this organization, and turning Southern and Latin America a continent that lost probably the 31st years of globalization. At the beginning, in the 1990s, the purpose of free market and opening borders for investment and trade, the United States and Canada had a plan for ALCA, an international agreement for free trade and investment in Latin America, Caribbean, and South America, right? And governments like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, the Kirchners in Argentina, they blocked in 2004 that international treaty to be finally being enforced, or actually to be approved. Well, guess what? Latin America decided not to participate at that degree. Then other countries signed bilateral agreements with the United States for international trade, and see where investment were transferred. Asia. Is Asia the region that attracted most of the investment? I was checking figures of 2021, last year. Asia is capturing around 80% of all foreign direct investment in the world, and then you have more or less split 8% and 10%, or 12% and 8% between Africa, 8%, and then Latin American and Caribbean countries with a 12%. So Latin America has been a region that has been left behind because of these policies against that look for economies more controlled by the state. And at some point in 2006, that was clear to me that was going to happen. I mean, with the ministry, I was able to travel in South America, to travel the Americas, and see that this was coming. And I saw that there was a moment to resign. Also, I always say that I resigned to the ministry at the moment that Chavez was very healthy. The barrel of oil was over $80, and it looked that he could last for more than a decade. I mean, that he could remain until 2030 or so. Well, that was not the reality with Chavez, but Maduro's continued that legacy, and probably in a more cruel way, in the way that he is implementing politics and repression in the country.
Thanks, Julian. I know you've been through a lot. As Itziar mentioned, you've been in Houston for many years, but you've also taught some of the best universities in Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. Just because people probably heard it in your bio, can you just explain for people, basically in terms of what you've been doing, say, for the last many years? PDVSA, those are the initials for basically Venezuela's national oil company, which Venezuela still has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Obviously, their production is down about 70+% since 8 years ago. But can you tell people what it means? What actually is the ad hoc administrative board? And what is the role of kind of outside experts, a lot of people who were at PDVSA, a lot of people who are people like Francisco Rinaldi and others and yourself.
Sure.
What is the role for the ad hoc board and the real control of PDVSA and CITCO within the United States?
So with all the previous background story in the context of the country, then we land into 2019. And that was the moment where it was the end of Nicolás Maduro period in office that was approved through an election in 2013. It was a period of 6 years. But an election that was run in 2018 was considered a sham, was considered fraudulent. It was not recognized by the international community, mostly European countries and countries in the Americas. And this is definitely an unusual case for international law, for international politics. And it refers to the doctrine in public international law that the states only recognize other states, but it's not their issue to recognize governments. Well, what happened in Venezuela is that a new trend, a new doctrine had been imposed through the act of a state, and a country like the United States and other members of the international community, other democracies actually, had complained and had rejected the fact that a president can continue in power based on an election that was and in a fraud, was a consequences of a fraud. So at that moment, the only institution that was democratically elected in Venezuela was the Venezuelan Congress, or the Venezuelan National Assembly. And in 2019, the National Assembly decided to take control also of the powers of the executive branch, appointing Juan Guaidó as the president of the Venezuelan National Assembly at the time, as the interim president of Venezuela, and got the recognition of, again, almost 60 nations around the world. So that recognition had been extended by the United States until today. And it remains as a player in that competition for the representation of the Venezuelan state abroad. So in 2019, when this happened, legal problems also emerged from these circumstances. And one of them was what can happen with the assets of the Venezuelan Central Bank or Venezuelan state-owned companies that are located abroad. A critical issue was definitely the situation of Citgo in the United States. And it required the representation of a legal entity that make a bridge between the ownership of Petróleos de Venezuela, an entity incorporated in Venezuela, and Citgo Petroleum Corporation, an entity incorporated, a red of 3 refineries in the United States. So the National Assembly created this ad hoc administrative board to represent the interests of the Venezuelan state or the national company PDVSA in the United States. And it had, as a consequence, a change in the administration of Citgo Petroleum Corporation in the United States. So this board started working in February 2019. I joined in June 2019 and started working with them. For me, working with this ad hoc board had been a crossroads of many of my interests, and definitely because, as I mentioned, I had this experience working in geopolitical issues or diplomacy, but also international law, arbitration, litigation, and many of the issues that this PDVSA ad hoc board had been facing in the last 3 years and a half have been massive litigation against assets of PDVSA in the United States, have been anti-corruption investigations at Citgo Petroleum Corporation since the arrival of the new board in 2019. The company, an investigation with the Department of Justice started, and many cases have been, made public, and have been already people plead guilty in many different type of cases of corruption. And we faced a number of litigations that were threatening the ownership of the company in the last 3 years. Other aspect, for example, I can tell you that the situation is so critical for Venezuelan assets or PDVSA assets in the United States. One of the other cases that is a landmark case that is in the news, or at least in the legal news, that called the attention of a lot of people, are the victims of the FARC in Colombia, American victims of the FARC in Colombia, or the ELN, 2 terrorist groups in Colombia, that are suing and requesting injunctions, trying to seize PDVSA's assets because Nicolás Maduro sponsored terrorism and supported guerrilla groups in Colombia. So these victims are enforcing judgments, default judgments against the FARC, but they're enforcing the judgment of these terrorist groups against Petróleos de Venezuela. So we're also facing litigation in these type of cases. We are very critical and fascinating. So it had been an experience that one of the probably more difficult cases that I have faced in my life. Probably in the future, people will see what we have been going on and will be amazed and shocked of many of the issues we have encountered. However, this year has been a different year. The results have been made public, and the recent results of the first quarter of Citgo Petroleum Corporation is kind of the new administration. We were able, after 3 years, to take the company to restore their activity of profits, and we're taking this new market that is more favorable for all companies. And this is a situation in which people say that luck is when preparation and opportunity meet, and that happened with the board, seeing that work for 3 years, defending the company and defending in litigation. We are now going through a time that seems more favorable for the protection of the asset, and also to comply with creditors and people that have invested in the past in the company, and PDVSA have to honor a number of contractual engagements.
And just one last question that then I want to turn to, especially the last few months. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has, disrupted global oil markets incredibly. It has big possible implications for Venezuela. But beforehand, maybe just to help people, kind of get an understanding. I think a lot of people always say, why is the opposition so ineffective? Why is it that Chavez and Maduro are able to stay in power now, 22 plus years? Besides having control of the military, besides billions of dollars probably over the years in drug money, controlling the press, controlling protests. There's also the external powers. You mentioned the U.S. and Western democracies recognizing the government of Guaido. But on the other side of that, there are those powers still working with and supporting Maduro and the current regime. The great tragedy, I think I try to highlight here with our events, is since World War II, the largest number of refugees in the world has been over 6 million now, has been Venezuela, second only to Syria. And it's the greatest economic and social collapse of a country in the entire world since World War II, outside of a war or civil war. So I think the dire intensity of it, I think sometimes gets forgotten. But maybe could you just briefly touch upon maybe China and the money and the loans that it'll extend to kind of help keep the regime in power. Russia, what it provides sometimes in terms of weaponry and technology, and the Cubans in terms of intelligence services. They're the security services on the ground. They're the people who disrupt and monitor opposition figures in Caracas and elsewhere. Can you talk about those three and what their roles are?
Quite a long question.
I know.
Also, I have done long answers as well, but let's see. So should I start with
China? You're with China, or whatever you like.
As I was mentioning at the beginning, in terms of what region of the world profited or had profited more from globalization and international trade, we have not definitely ignored Asia. And of course, how China was able to capture investment and become the bigger manufacturer of all goods that we have. You see that in the social mobility that exists in some of the Chinese society, the economic growth of that nation that happened in the first decade of the 2000 of the 21st century. China was not what it is today, what it was in the 1990s. It was on track to become what it is now, but many people have warned of that situation, but the priorities were in other places. And it's now, I think, from Obama's administration that it has been more clear that the concerns of the U.S. foreign policy shouldn't be in the Middle East or Afghanistan. It is actually Asia. And that was, I believe, a change that we can trace, we can notice the changes in the U.S. foreign policy towards the Pacific. Although the U.S. has been involved and engaged in the Pacific more probably than in Latin America, because the conflict has been different. But then we have, with the terrorist priority in the foreign policy, that concentration in the Middle East. At the same time, China was developing and India was growing. So one of the approaches of Chinese foreign policy had been not only manage foreign investment. It's not only that they had major companies in China, but the way that they approach to countries and developing nations is not only engaging in investment, so injecting money in those economies, but also providing loans that then put ties to create ties with these governments, with Chinese foreign policy. And this happened because they take these countries also outside of the multilateral funding. So if they reach relation, and that happened in Ecuador or in Venezuela, they provide loans to these governments that they can be repaid with hydrocarbon production. And those loans are not linked or tied with the policies of the Inter-American Development Bank or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, right? So they are not. I mean, if Argentina goes to the IMF and asks for a loan, they have then to offer in exchange being responsible with public spending, control inflation, and things that being responsible in the management of the economy. For some politicians, it will be against populism and the tools that they need to remain in power, and they cause suffering. They accuse them in the imperialism and international institution, but is their management of the economy that is creating more inflation, devaluation, poverty, lack of investment. As I was saying at the beginning, it is sad to see how in the last 30 years, you see the trends of foreign investments in Latin America, and you see how it is just above Africa, that actually Africa is coming up, attracting more investments, but it's Asia that controls most of the attraction in developing nations, and that is a bag. It's not unlimited, the amount of capital that is out there for investment. We had a peak 7 years ago of $2 trillion of dollars available for investment every year, according to the United Nations. And then with COVID, that collapsed completely, almost to a half of that amount. And 2021 was, it took over again to 1.5 trillion. So it's a limited amount of money that is there for competition. So when a nation decided, no, I want my company to have control of this investment. I want my parliament to change the law, or the executive branch to change the law, so no need to offer rule of law and due process to companies. And they will come. Well, guess what? They will go somewhere else. Who could imagine 30 years ago that Guyana would be the hottest spot in South America for investment? Who could imagine that Brazil could be the #1 oil producer in Latin America, leaving behind Mexico and Venezuela? I think many of my Venezuelan fellows will laugh at any Brazilian saying that in the 1990s. And the policies had changed, so we have seen that. I think the crisis with esteroids in the case of Venezuela, it's not only that it's an economic crisis, it's what you mentioned, Ronan. And it's not journalists saying that, it's not the opposition saying that, it's UNHCR, so an agency for refugees of the United Nations, saying that there are 6 million of Venezuelans that have fled the country and are escaping something. People can create different narrative of what they are escaping. Violence, authoritarianism, mismanagement of the economy, political persecution, there can be multiple type of reasons why they're escaping an opposition as well that fails to take power. But the thing, and the more dramatic thing that when you study these cases, it is young people that see that they have no future and opportunities. That's very dramatic when you see that. And you see that the population that is leaving the country, walking through the Andes, and then walking through Colombia, going to Ecuador, Peru, Chile, or they are now crossing Rio Grande here in Texas. I mean, it's very dramatic what is going on. And I think there's more awareness today than it used to be in the past. And of course, I kind of forgot to mention that the situations not only have been enunciated by UNHCR, is also the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is in the process to open an investigation for crimes against humanity in Venezuela. Starting for crimes committed in 2017. Check the news, probably tomorrow you will get more news about these actions of the International Criminal Court. But it's the only country in South America that has now an investigation that the ICC prosecutor have decided to initiate that investigation. So yes, the situation is more than just an economic crisis. It's going more of a case of oppression and a regime that exercises authoritarianism and violation of human rights against the population.
And then just to turn to this year, oil has always been a factor in Venezuela. It was for many years the most prominent, the best economy in Latin America. You mentioned Chavez and Putin both had incredible luck of getting into power and riding basically 10 years of incredibly consistent and often escalating oil prices. They both had that great good fortune. Now oil prices again are something that are coming to impact Venezuela. With Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the United States has had severe oil sanctions on Venezuela since 2019. The Europeans, especially, if they're really going to wean themselves off Russian oil and potentially Russian gas, I don't know about LNG from Venezuela, we'll talk about maybe at the end, but some of that oil production is going to be made up elsewhere. And it may be from countries the United States does not have good relations with. They don't necessarily want to support or give money to an oppressive regime, a brutal regime, be Maduro in Venezuela or in Iran. But if it's a choice between the Russians and the Venezuelans or Iranians, they may be willing to look the other way or look into negotiations. Some of you may have been signed up in March. We had an event with Ambassador Carlos Becchio. He is the ambassador of the interim government of Juan Guaido, their representative in the United States. We had that set in March. It had to be canceled because they actually were quietly, I think, having negotiations with the U.S. government and in turn with the Venezuelan government of Maduro. Can you talk about where we are now? Sure. This is, it's been over 10 years until this March, the United States, a high official in U.S. administration, Democrat or Republican, has been in Venezuela. First time it happened in March. We haven't had an ambassador physically on the ground in Venezuela since 2010, I think. But Ambassador James Story is there today or yesterday, I think.
Yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
And it's pretty amazing that it's not even secretly anymore, but it's pretty openly the U.S. is saying we're willing to consider our options with a rogue regime. But what do you think is realistic and what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, you have mentioned at the end a key word, realistic, because if you follow the scholars who study foreign policy and international relations, there's always this classical debate between idealists and realists, and how the foreign policy of the United States can change from one trend to the other, or it can be a mix of both, depending the front, depending the region, depending the topic. Probably of course, the best way for the U.S. is when that idealism with realistic position can go together. And that turned very effective. Probably was during the Second World War, the moment when these two the ideals and the realistic importance of their actions were matched. What we have seen now with in 2021 with the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, one of the key factors for the analysis, in my opinion, is the change of the foreign policy of Germany towards Russia. They were so close to start using the Nord Stream pipeline number 2. $12 billion of investment in this second line for importing Russian gas. And during the construction, not only Trump administration, but Biden administration warned about the dependency, actually the interdependency. They were concerned more about the Western European dependency on Russian gas. And what you could get from European ministries of foreign affairs in general, but particularly in Germany, was chill. This is business and this is politics. We can separate business from politics. Calm down, or how, Ricky, Lucy in the Lucy Bowl,
yes.
She said to Ricky Ricardo, calma down. She said to Ricky Ricardo, right? So, calma down. We will continue doing businesses with Russia because the gas is cheaper than importing LNG from South Texas, from the Gulf Coast. We will continue doing businesses, and we know how to handle Putin. And if you remember, it was early this year. The United States, which I think was one of the best strategies that they implemented at the beginning of the year, was warning the world that that invasion will happen. And the world was, nah, it won. It won. They need Nord Stream pipeline number 2. No. Putin won't do that. He's just threatening. Even Ukrainians, even Zelensky was not realizing that that was actually happening. And all intelligence information from the US did better than they did last 15 years ago, maybe 16 years, 17 years ago.
Or even Afghanistan.
Yeah, exactly. So it was doing better this time. And they were right. So those two, that tenet of Germany's foreign policy by saying we can separate businesses from politics, we will continue doing businesses, we know how to handle this autocrat, it failed. And it failed dramatically. Probably it failed to that degree that even Switzerland changed neutrality in this conflict. So of course, we're seeing a conflict and a reaction of the Western world that we haven't seen in decades. In terms of how can we continue doing businesses with governments and people that do not share our values. Kind of not it's not a simple idea to analyze and also to implement, because you need sometimes what others have. I remember an Oscar Wilde play that one of the characters of the play say, "What is a cynic?" And he said, "Well, a cynic is a person who knows the price of everything but the value of nothing." But Oscar Wilde was not an idealist, and the next comment in the play is, well, an idealist is somebody who believes that everything has a value. So it's kind of how we manage these two very complex notions. One of the things that in reality, and this is why my intersection with the law is also something that had been in an emerging practice. A key application of the law in diplomacy and international law is international sanctions. So if we had, the practice of sanctions have multiplied for international attorneys. It had affected more states than ever. The United States has implemented more sanctions, more countries are doing sanctions. Even China is doing sanctions. Russia is doing sanctions against in retaliation. So there are more sanctions that are exposing the fact that at some point, if you represent a threat to international security, if you do not share our values, we can limit the transactions that we will be able to make. And of course, I'm linking this with energy and oil. The prices of oil that we have today are not a consequence of just Ukrainian war. We just went through probably one of the most dramatic shutdown of the global economy that we have ever lived in the last 120 years, probably. What we went through is crazy. I mean, all the support that governments did, or the state control that government had of the economy, or the shutdowns of economic sectors, I mean, will have a consequence, and at some point, we will have to start paying that. Well, that we have inflation, we have devaluation, we have huge amounts of expending. But of course, the situation of the conflict, the sanctions imposed that affect the energy sector, create this premium that we are all paying in Europe and the Western world. I think Zelensky in the G7 meeting yesterday, the position of the Ukrainians is they are kind of the shield of authoritarian regime that wants to have an impact in the international world order, and then the rest of democracies. And you see that in the support that Zelensky has got in the last month. Part of that support has been in terms of sanctions, not only in the energy sector, the financial sector, individual sanctions. I mean, the practice of sanctions has turned like a very sophisticated technology. And it's a tool. But again, you remember when Chavez used oil for getting control of the OAS, the Organization of American States? Well, this is also countries saying, United States, now I'm not dependent of Russian oil. I have more power in my position to ban importing oil from Russia. But it was not the same for United States partners in Europe. They are more exposed. They are not as agile or have no capacity to react to this situation. And I think that move, the visit that is taking place yesterday, today, and tomorrow of Ambassador James Story in Venezuela, that yesterday met with a delegation, a group of members of the Maduro regime, as well as with interim President Juan Guaidó. So of course you will see in the news that this visit is related to 8 detainees in Venezuela, 5 of them former executive of CICO, other former Marines or of the United States. So I believe Venezuela is probably the country with more hostages of the United States at this point. And that is a main concern for the foreign service of the United States. Of course, in the G7 meeting, there was that request that from France, and that probably was reflecting the position of other European countries, that they need to get other sources of energy. Because if the war that continue through the winter, they will need to the supply of energy sources to go through the winter month of 2022 and 2023. Probably there was not only Putin miscalculation, probably was the whole world miscalculation that this war will reach more than 127 days. And probably people thought that that conflict will end in a series of weeks, probably, maybe days. And one of the data that we're collecting is that, well, the Russian army doesn't seem as efficient as they claim, probably. Even though they are a superpower, military power, but not a strong economy for the international community. So that also weakened their position, right? I think the economy of Texas alone is bigger than Russian economy. Yeah, it's way bigger.
And just you're related to it, maybe some questions. All of this is perfect for a Houston audience or Woodlands audience. Great energy questions here. We talked about long before this, the most severe sanctions, 2019, under Chavez into Maduro's rule. Venezuela went from 3.2 to 700,000 barrels. Total collapse of 70+% collapse in production. Besides the sanctions, there's also massive corruption. There is huge inefficiency, and there's an incredible brain drain. And you're a great example of it. One of our wonderful interns, Maria, here with her fiance Carlos, two wonderful, smart, well-educated Venezuelans who are here this evening. Venezuela has lost so many good people. It has lost so much capacity. Even if these sanctions were lifted, what's possible? Chris William asks, is the Venezuelan oil industry capable of helping increase oil supply? And then Sai asks, says, I worked with PDVSA as a contractor employee for 27 years. What do we do now? What is our future in Venezuela? What's realistically possible? And to increase production, does that take 6 months, a year? What's realistic?
I think answering
anyone has questions?
Probably the last question. Let's start with that one. 2021 is something different than the last 30 years, and probably very different than 2020. 2022, way different than 2021. I think the scenarios are changing, and one of the factors is that even Maduro's regime has now more interest to get international recognition than ever. There should be an interest even from that regime just to run as soon as possible an election that just may solve the issue of sanctions and international recognition to integrate this opportunity that the conflict has created. I mean, just having not only the United Nations ban to oil, it was around 760,000 barrels of oil a day. Europe has way more than that. And something that was unthinkable in February, they approved last month that ban until for the end of the year of creating that ban to Russian oil if the conflict continues. So there are many incentives now for good readers to the global situation, that Latin America may have an opportunity to get into the international world order and trying to do the things better than they did in the 1990s. In order to answer that, I need to also mention one of the agreements of the G7. It was the agreement to invest $600 billion for developing countries in the next 5 years. And why is that? That is a response to the Belt and Road Initiative of China of investing 1.2 trillion in the next decade. So of course we are seeing these new opportunities for regional globalization is turning more that idea of Western world connected with Asia to looking for other opportunities, because the global pandemic and the conflict in Russia that affected supply chain channels is now creating more opportunity for near shoring. So production that is near to the delivery point. And Latin America is in a good position of that. Are politics in Latin America showing that they can take that trend? I think that's a question mark. Because that will be the response of what Petro is going to do with investments for Colombia. What López Obrador will be doing in the next 2 years to end his term in Mexico. What's going to happen in Brazil with the upcoming election that Lula seems as a favorite in Brazil. Argentina, what Argentina is planning to do in terms of being successful in attracting investment, that they have definitely failed. And on what Maduro is going to do and the interim government of Venezuela. I think the pressure is now restoring the negotiations in Mexico. As idealist or institutionalist, it seems, is the only solution that is now the only alternative that they have. Definitely other ways of solution for the Venezuelan crisis doesn't seem feasible in the near future, and it had been more pressure on trying to get a diplomatic solution or a negotiated solution to the Venezuelan conflict. I think there are incentives. One of the questions mentioned the difficult situation of the industry inside of the country. Yes, I mean, environmental liabilities, destruction of infrastructure, the brain drain of the country. But nations can be rebuilt. Reconstruction plans can be approved. The question is that this country has no problems under the ground. All the problems they have are above the ground. If there are laws, there are regulations. When we study law and we study different regimes in different countries, Latin America and Africa, we can go through hydrocarbon codes and read on contracts and go through them and see that these projects won't succeed. Regulation has that impact. Regulation at some point turns to be a technology. It's created by humans. It involves ideas. It created rights and obligations. It created incentives. So it's a way to promote freedom of property and rights of property and free market. And when you don't see that, you see the failure of an economic system. And again, it's very different the way investment has been attractive in Asia because many of the countries that took that advantage of free market and capitalism are also autocracies and dictatorships in Asia. But in Latin America, we have proved that there's no tropical Vietnamese model or South American Chinese model. There's no way that has been so far implemented. And one of the key factors is the respect of rule of law and sanctity of contracts. We have countries that there are democracies that are unstable, and with the change of the government, they change the rules, and that creates delays in the performance of obligations and contracts, and delay their capacity for development.
Okay, and then just for sake of time, I'll just do two questions. I know they're hard to sometimes surmise them all, but I'll put these two together, then maybe one at the end just to wrap it up. Related to sanctions, I suppose thinking back to like the oil for food program in the 90s and way Iraqi, Saddam would try to get around it. And Robert asks, if the U.S. puts restrictions on that, can the U.S. put restrictions as to how the money could actually be used in Venezuela? And then somewhat similarly related to that, someone else asked, what's the connection between Iranian oil, Russian shipping, and Venezuela with reference to confiscation of Iranian oil being shipped to Venezuela? I suppose can you talk about, the cat and mouse game sometimes of avoiding sanctions, and how realistic is it to kind of maybe require money that might be derived from oil sales to Venezuela being put to use for the Venezuelan people, for education, for hospitals, for food, instead of the regime?
I think the sanctions regime that have been imposed, particularly from the United States, because probably the one that affects the most. And it's not only the real effects of the sanction. It's just that when you have a country like Venezuela or sanctions against Russia, and you want to do investments with these countries, it's not, number one, from the start, they are not easy countries for doing businesses. Number two, then you have, as an investor, more expensive in terms of legal advice and opinions, whether what will be the cost. Because there are options. I mean, Venezuela's sanctions are specific. They have targeted individuals, they have targeted specific companies. So they do not affect imports of medicines or food or trade of different goods. The question is people from other sectors. I mean, I sell shoes. Why I will pick Venezuela among many markets if I will need to comply with many regulations of the United States, maybe asking for a license from OFAC and reporting for 10 years anything that I do in that country. It's kind of a mess that you will enter. So sanctions will deter also the actions of doing trade. The issue now with the effects of the sanctions, the legal effects, but also the geopolitical opportunities, is that are there now more incentives for country to get out of the sanction system? And again, yesterday it was during the G7 meeting, there was a request from an official from the French Foreign Services to the United States to try to take Iran and Venezuela back to the market, at least temporarily, to try to manage the difficulties of Europe in getting access to hydrocarbon resources. But those initiatives are just, they will explore those options. Because what is going to happen is, I was checking Twitter to see Marco Rubio reaction and all Republican reaction. What is going to happen? Because there is also a proposal in the U.S. Congress for a law that will ban U.S. imports of Iranian and Venezuelan oil. But this oil is not coming to the U.S. It's trying to redirect that oil to Europe. And there's an interest for sure of the United States to help its allies in this conflict in Europe in a good position of power. Again, I think the G7 and the moment that they invited Zelensky to the G7 meeting, it shows the leaders of G7 nations, developed countries, talking to the leader of a country, an unusual leader. I don't see how many other presidents of government will be as Zelensky, walking on the street with their team, and using all these soft skills as an actor and a lawyer and know how to speak. And he had been very skilled in taking advantage of that, but definitely risking his life to a degree that probably where are the leaders that we can pick that will be eager to do that? And those are the scenarios. Imagine if Russia succeeds in taking control. We see now that it's less probable that they will take control of the whole country. So they will take control of some regions. Okay. Imagine that they take control of the regions, killing Zelensky. Imagine that they could take control of the whole country with Zelensky in exile, or they kill Zelensky. What will be the world if we have in this scenario? And we need to start, analyzing all these possibilities, and then check what's next after that. If you see, I don't know if you follow, if you see Russian television, what Putin is saying in his speeches, he's comparing himself with Pedro el Grande, right? That, at some point, he's trying to get these...
Peter the Great.
Yeah. I'm sorry, yeah.
It's okay.
Okay. I'm sorry, yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah, he was not saying that in Spanish. It was my brain.
He was probably saying it in Russian.
Yeah, he was saying that in Russian, definitely.
Very disconnect between the brain and the mouth.
Exactly. So, NATO meeting starts today in the evening. Actually, the meetings are tomorrow, and we will see what happened with Finland and Sweden application for NATO. And if the excuse to invade Ukraine was that NATO would be close to Russia borders, well, guess what? You will have a lot of border with NATO if that is approved, since today it was announced that Turkey dropped their veto power, their veto to accept Sweden and Finland. So, interesting times, and I don't think those are the times that we were eager to go through.
And if you guys will stay, just one last kind of question, kind of to where we leave it. Also, I would just say the kind of complicated realities of oil and gas. At the height of the Cold War, I think it was in 1963, the Friendship Pipeline was built between the Soviet Union and Europe. And over the decades, billions of barrels of Russian oil, Soviet oil, went over to Western Europe. And they were happy to take it then. They're still more independent now. So the idea that we would be working with unfortunate regimes in Iran or Venezuela is, I suppose, nothing new. This is not to say an easy question, but maybe an interesting way to end it. Someone asked, given your experience with how Venezuelan authoritarianism turned out, do you see any similar signs or concerns in the U.S.? And then just related to that in general, I suppose, where do you see things going in the next few years? Do you see any hope for the opposition, or even that you could go back yourself anytime soon?
What do you say?
Would you see, you think there's any chance you could go back anytime soon?
Oh, go for it. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose you've seen authoritarianism. You've seen
Yeah.
kind of bending of the rule of law. Or do you have concerns
when
with
you were preparing the question, saying the question, I remember an anecdote that I had with Ambassador Oscar Hernandez, and you can relate because it happened a meeting that happened in Los Angeles recently. So I was with the Venezuelan delegation in 2004. In Monterrey, Mexico. There was a Summit of Americas at that time in Monterrey, and you have the president of all Americas attending the meeting, as you had in Los Angeles, right, a few weeks ago. And during that meeting, Hugo Chavez blocked the Declaración de Monterrey, Monterrey's declaration. That was the final document of the meeting. And Hugo Chavez was blocking because he wanted the document to say not representative democracy, but participating democracy. You know, a concept that they created. And they wanted to block the declaration. They put a footnote explaining the difference that they have with that Venezuela does not believe with representative democracy, that they believe in participating democracy and all that stuff. And of course, the Mexican government wanted to have a clean declaration. That is something that you as a host country wants to get from these type of meetings. Or that was they took care in the past. And at some point, they called for a meeting to my ambassador Oscar Hernandez, and it was the Mexican ambassador for the OAS, and he said, Oscar, so they tried many different ways to change Venezuelan position. And Oscar Hernandez was, no, I mean, I have to comply with this position, we have to keep that footnote. At some point, the Mexican ambassador said, you know what, Oscar, we have been working for more than 20 years. We know each other. I mean, I know that probably it's not your position, but it's a government position, and we're running out of time. So we need to get this declaration signed, and this is it. So he ended the negotiation, said, but you know what, Oscar? I just miss the Cold War so much. Because it was so easy to work those times. I mean, there were two groups. You have to pick one, or you jump from one to the other depending on your interest, and that's it. But it was clear. What we're going through is now a mess. I think we're still in that mess. We're still, and there are different issues that we need to tackle. And the Venezuelan situation is in that hurricane. It's not in the center of the hurricane. It's just turning because I mean when the experiences started in 2019, probably that was a plan for 3 months. and we have been now for 3 years and a half.
Yeah.
Nobody was expecting that, as nobody saw the global pandemic coming. Some people say Bill Gates saw that, and he said that in a tech talk, I'm not sure. But and authoritarian regimes, they enjoy being in COVID. They enjoy putting people stay at home.
Sure.
And I will continue to remain in power and spending more and getting control of companies. So people took advantage of this situation. We're paying the consequence of that now, and but new realities and new interests will emerge again as well from the idealist and institutionalist side. We have more institutions being more active. We have this new prosecutor and international criminal court that people will believe that is a still naive institution, only 20 years of creation. But it has been more and more active. You have seen the prosecutor of the ICC in Kiev acting. He visited Venezuela and he opened investigation in front of Nicolás Maduro.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking about an attorney that it was appointed by Secretary General Guterres, UN Secretary General, to prosecute the crimes of ISIS and spent years in Iraq. So it's not, yeah.
He knows what he's doing.
And it seems very courageous in the actions he's taking. So we have to see how this situation evolves. I think there are challenges in terms of international law and geopolitics, but there are opportunities that are now turning to more interest. Will finally Europe and the United States look more to Latin America and negotiate more in Latin America to find opportunities? Will the governments of those countries be open to participate in the role in this global economic order that probably this initiative of investments now in the framework of the G7 can be created? I think this is a question mark that we will see. Let me give you one final example. NAFTA, international treaty with Mexico, United States, and Canada. NAFTA, during the campaign for presidency of Donald Trump, he said that NAFTA was the worst international treaty signed by the United States ever, right? And when he said the worst, he claimed he took the commercial balance, the trade balance between Mexico and the US, and said they are $50 billion, better than the US in doing trade. So we're losing. I mean, that's such a narrow analysis of the role of the US as the biggest economy in the world, the biggest military in the world. The relation that you create with trade is you cannot run the assessment just with the Excel file. You should look at the relation, diplomacy, ties with the society and both. If you don't look at those aspects, you will have a president of Mexico that will say to the president of the United States, I will not go to your meeting of Summits of America because you did not invite the dictator in Cuba, the dictator in Nicaragua, and the dictator in Venezuela. I think it has improved trade and investment, create peace, create relations that go beyond just commerce and macroeconomics and microeconomic numbers. It creates ties, and I think it is necessary to boost that with Latin America. The problem is that those disagreements, you see the effects of the results in decades. It's not only that you approve NAFTA and then Mexico turned to be the Mexico that it is today, just 5 years after they signed NAFTA. It takes decades to create those ties and to create businesses that will develop and create employment and wealth in those nations. And again, I remember being in Mexico in that meeting in 2004 where a cell phone call was so expensive. It was unreasonable how expensive was cell phone communication in Mexico. Now Mexicans, they can travel to the US and Canada with their cell phone. It's a hyper-connected country, at least some regions. Of course, we can discuss about how Nuevo León is different than Chiapas. That is, obvious the differences that you can find, different realities that you can find in that country. A country with 30 million people living in poverty. But it's not the same Mexico that it used to be. It has more sophisticated Mexico. It has a Mexico with a very sophisticated elite. A
bigger middle class.
Yeah, it had to definitely more middle class than Spain probably, but it is required to get that idea that these international trade agreements are not only just because of the transaction. There's more than that, and economic ties and diplomatic ties and geopolitical support. Recently, the Biden administration also invested on that in Asia and created economic ties and agreements and development for international treaty. Sadly, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was an international agreement that the United States decided to withdraw from that. But those ties create, again, more ties in international relations that are needed. Particularly in the case that they want to balance or counterbalance the power of China of using their financial resources and technology in this economic order.
And just right before we finish, I'll just mention again, in a little over 2 weeks, we're hosting another event up here in the Woodlands on Iran, the Iranian puzzle, nuclear, foreign, and domestic politics with Iranian expert Mohammad Tabar. He, again, is someone who's a long-time expert in Iran. Sadly, he's not able to go back himself because of what he's written or what he said. So hopefully you'll join us there. And also, just a reminder for any of you, feel free to join us in any of our programs in Houston. Your membership applies throughout all of Houston or wherever we have events. Next week, we're hosting Dr. Peter Hotez. A lot of you might remember him. He's been on the news on CNN, on Fox, on all of the stations. All during COVID. He actually also was nominated earlier this year for Nobel Peace Prize for the vaccine he and his colleague developed for COVID. He developed a vaccine that is very cheap and relatively easy to produce, like a per unit cost of like $1.90, and they purposely made it patent free, so it could just be sent out to the developing world. They could use it however they want. And then if you can make it in August, we're honored to host the most recent Secretary of Defense, who's not currently in office, but the most recent Secretary of Defense, former Secretary of Defense, the 26th, I think, Secretary of Defense of the United States, Mark Esper, in Houston on August 8th. And please, will you all join me in thanking a great and longtime great friend of John.